the Griffith University acknowledges the people who are the traditional custodians of the land. We pay respect to the elders past and present and emerging, and extend their respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island peoples. So the way that we'll run the presentation today is I'll give an overview on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, so the latest findings from the sixth assessment that came out a few years ago, and some of the implications for Australia and the Gold Coast, and talk about multi-level responses, and then Michael will talk about the key research findings, implications for the Gold Coast strategy as well, and the Sustainable Development Goals and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And then after Michael finishes, we'll have Q&A, and you have an opportunity to ask questions and see if we can answer them. So I was one of the lead authors for Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So the working group 2 basically looks at impacts, adaptation and vulnerability. So I led the adaptation work in the Small Islands chapter to trying to understand the implications of climate impacts to small islands in particular, and also co-led the Summary for Policymakers adaptation section as well, to get a bigger picture messaging on adaptation. So some of the key focus at the moment, especially in the policy and research space, is trying to really understand, well, what is successful adaptation? Because nobody wants to waste money, but also the policies and strategies we put in place, we don't want them to cause negative outcomes either. So there's increasingly focus also on understanding and defining maladaptation, because there's this mistaken belief that all the adaptation actions just have really positive outcomes, but sometimes, for instance, with ecosystem-based adaptation, we are increasingly seeing examples where people, for instance, cut down a really thriving biodiversity area and plant monocrops, and then they say, well, that's climate adaptation. And obviously, those types of approaches are not very effective or good. So increasingly, we're looking at, well, if we are implementing and planning for climate adaptation, what are the actual benefits for humans? What are the benefits for ecosystem services, and what are the equity outcomes as well? So trying to understand the more marginalized groups in our societies and make sure that adaptation is actually working for everybody. And also looking at transformational potential. So are there opportunities to do things differently? And then also reducing greenhouse gas emissions as part of that. Because we know the kind of most common example is that we get a heat wave, everybody cranks up their air cons, and the emissions coming from that are massive. So how can we implement adaptation in a way that also doesn't lead to increased emissions? And in the Intergovernmental Panel, we also looked at understanding the interactions between risk, different sectors, and also on benefits. So, for instance, how do different sectors impact each other? What are the kind of temporal dimensions and also spatial, but also the multiple response options. How does one adaptation actions that we implement somewhere else actually impact a different part of a community or a different sector, maybe negatively? So really trying to understand the feasibility of those actions and also broader benefits. So in the United Nations framework, so we have the Paris Agreement that most countries have signed up to. So that came in 2015, and part of that global agreement is the Global Goal on Adaptation. And that's looking at the really global level for climate and how we adapt. And so in the latest assessment, we also looked at this, but in a different way. So we looked at, for instance, climate-sensitive health outcomes. So this is from the health chapter. Also trying to understand the different levels of global warming and what does that mean for adaptation, and how do the different risk levels change if we do proactive, effective adaptation, or if we just don't do anything, and while the temperatures are increasing. So it's looking at different types of scenarios and risks and trying to give broader general guidance on that. And there's also this wider link between climate change adaptation benefits, but also the Sustainable Development Goals as well. So with the no poverty, we find that the restored and connected habitats can provide corridors for vulnerable species, for instance. And there's green buildings, green spaces, clean water. And in the assessment, what we looked at, or one of the findings was that there's really big portion of global population that's highly vulnerable to climate change impacts. And so what are some of the adaptation actions that then also support the SDGs? And policies that increase youth access to land, credit, knowledge, and skills, for instance, can support agri-food employment as well. And in the actual assessment, we have lots of tables, but also looking at those interconnections between an adaptation action and how one adaptation action can actually support multiple SDGs, and trying to understand those wider benefits as well. So the way that adaptation has progressed globally in research is we really, in the 1990s, everybody thought that we're going to reduce emissions, so we were not going to have to adapt. And that was very much the first and second assessment. And now with the sixth assessment, there's a lot more knowledge and information. There's a lot more understanding of the implementation processes and the plans and policies that are being put in place globally. So some of the work that we did, especially for the summary for policymakers, was really trying to understand, well, what adaptation options are actually feasible. And we looked at different system transitions that are needed, but also the different types of benefits and the different types of feasibilities that a particular adaptation option could have. And so a lot of the IPCC assessments, we look at peer-reviewed literature that has been published in scientific journals, and then trying to understand where the evidence base is. So for instance, in this figure, the kind of bigger the circle, the more confidence there is in the scientific literature that that's a feasible option. And for each of these options, we looked at also different dimensions, so whether it's feasible socially and culturally, whether it's feasible economically, and that's always the big question is, well, how much is this going to cost? Because sometimes we think about climate change adaptation as, well, just do business as usual and change some small actions, but we don't necessarily understand that a lot of the things that we need will cost, and then that also requires discussions about prioritization, and that's one of the reasons why we always discuss the importance of having an adaptation plan or policy. And especially in the UN, it's very much, a lot of the funding also for adaptation, the adaptation finance, is then tied to national adaptation plans. And plans are important in the sense that they help you to also think about prioritization. And a lot of the adaptation plans also look at the climate risks across a city, across the nation, and trying to also think about the different levels of governance, but also where and what areas would be needing a particular option fastest. So adaptation is a lot of our prioritization as well. So this table is from the Australasia chapter. So in the IPCC, we have different regional chapters. So as I said, I was on the small islands, which covers basically all small islands of the world. Australasia chapter covers Australia and New Zealand. So, and then we have chapters on South Asia, Latin America, North America. So it's trying to understand regionally what those risks are. Although the Australasia chapter, Australia and New Zealand, they also tried to look at some of the kind of broader implications for the Pacific Islands as well. But basically this table is trying to understand, well, what are the key risks for Australia? And you can, mine's very small. So you can see the sectors there, roads and rail, urban and rural built environment, electricity, ports, telecommunications, and stormwater, wastewater, and water supply. So these are some of the examples where we are increasingly going to see increasing risks. But there's also adaptation options, obviously, so that the authors summarized the best available scientific literature on the different sectors and options as well. And what was new with this assessment as well was that they looked at intersector dependencies as well. Because traditionally we've thought about adaptation, okay, these actions are for the water sector, this is what the water sector needs to do, or this is for the electricity sector, or this is for the roads. But we know that in real life the kind of silos approach don't really exist. So we are increasingly starting to think about the intersectoral dependencies and how different adaptation options can actually benefit multiple sectors. And that also becomes then a question, obviously, on prioritization, but also sharing costs and having a more systematic approach, for instance, for a city, at the city level. Some of the other considerations in climate adaptation, so this is also from the Australasia chapter, but this is looking at Brisbane. So it's some research showing how, you have the kind of lower socioeconomic areas of the city, and what happens when, for instance, you have a heat wave. So where are most of the calls coming from? And part of the discussion, especially in the sixth assessment, was very much around climate justice. So how do we make sure that the adaptation actions and plans and policies we put in place are delivering benefits across all neighbourhoods and all socioeconomic groups? So this could come down, for instance, for health services, for access to health services, access to air conditioning, access to financial support for in adapting to climate change. So the equity and justice aspect has been crucial, especially in the sixth assessment. And part of so there's quite a big literature, theoretical literature around adaptation pathways, and that focuses really on the decision-making processes. And although a lot of the literature has been quite theoretical, what we are seeing is that governments all across the world are actually starting to use adaptation pathways thinking. And that's just not national governments, but also a lot of state governments. There's a lot of interest in understanding when do we make what types of decisions, and also understanding when an adaptation option might not longer be effective. So this is also from the Australasia chapter, trying to understand the adaptation pathway thinking for risk on heat-related mortality and morbidity for people and for wildlife in Australia. I mean, we've seen in some of the cases, for instance, in Perth a few years ago, massive deaths among the fruit bat population just because their bodies can't handle the heat anymore that they are under. And it's a lot of the times it is about understanding the feasibility, but also the timelines for different options. So when we talk about ecosystem-based adaptation for coastal adaptation, so in the small islands, it's very much has been focused on mangroves, but we know that when the sea levels keep rising, the mangroves won't be keeping up. So understanding that once you make a decision and invest in an adaptation strategy, that's not forever. It might be, okay, this option is really feasible for the next 10 years. Then we need to keep checking. And the adaptation pathways thinking gives you kind of checkpoints or decision points, understanding, well, is something working, or is something, or have the conditions changed so much that we actually need to rethink the different types of options. But with the adaptation pathways as well, it doesn't rely on a single strategy. So as you can see here, it's multiple decisions, multiple strategies, and once you start implementing them, it is also doing the measuring and evaluation and monitoring as well. And that is always one of the big questions that we get in IPCC as well is, well, how do I know that the action that I'm putting in place is effective in my local context? Because a lot of the climate adaptation, I mean, when we talk about emission reduction, that's very much, we know how to measure emissions, but we don't really have a good handle yet on what does effective adaptation look like, because it will differ. Like, it differs a lot. If you think about Mount Isa, they wouldn't have issues with coastal inundation or rising sea levels, but I mean, this is what Gold Coast will definitely need to be thinking. There's also different abilities and different adaptive capacities across cities, across communities and systems as well. And this is all available online as well, if you want to have a look at the chapter. So adaptation in Australia, so this is mostly a snapshot. So Australia doesn't actually have a national adaptation plan. So a lot of the countries who signed up for the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, one of the requirements is to have a national adaptation plan. At least developing countries have them. Developing countries have them. A lot of developed countries have a national adaptation plan that sets out what are the risks for the country and what are the priority actions and what should we be thinking for the future. So for instance, the UK has already a climate change law. They have climate change committees and 5-year mandatory reporting period, how they are progressing, for instance, on adaptation to climate change. Finland, I think, did their first national adaptation plan 2005. So there is a lot of learning up there. So in Australia, the Albanese government made the commitment to have a national adaptation plan. And so last year, there was a national climate risk assessment, which is nearly finished, so looking at the risks for Australia. And so that's going to be released early 2024. There is also a commitment for the National Adaptation Plan. And so the consultation, so the federal government is releasing a discussion paper in the next few weeks, and there will be sector-wide consultation across Australia. And the discussion paper has been developed last year in consultation with different climate change experts. So I'm very curious to see what that looks like. So the consultations will run 2024, and the plan will be released or finalised 2025 at this stage. So it is coming, so that's good news. But when we talk about national adaptation plans, a lot of people think, oh, well, if there's no national adaptation plan, nothing is happening in that country, which is not true for Australia. So we have seen increasingly in the last few years, states picking up adaptation planning, but also local governments having adaptation plans. And that's been really crucial, especially when we talk about locally led adaptation, because a lot of the adaptation actions, as I said, should be fit to that particular place or city. So, and there's lots of networks, there's ICLEI, there's lots of cities and mayors networks, and they are really leading in this area. So even if at the national level, it's not necessarily progressing, that doesn't mean that there's nothing happening. And we need all the levels involved in the discussions, but also making sure that the federal government or the state government are not making plans and policies that actually don't fit the local government. So we need to also understand the different interplay between different levels as well. And as I said, so obviously Queensland has the climate adaptation strategy and the QCOAST 2100, and the City of Gold Coast has the coastal adaptation plan already in place and climate resilience and sustainability strategy as well. So there is also here lots of enthusiasm, hopefully, for adaptation. But I'll give it over to Michael at this point.
Okay, thank you, Anna. So, drawing on there, first of all, thank you very much for coming today. It's lovely to see so many faces out there. Out of interest, hands up if I taught you at some point. Oh dear, you poor things. Well, you seem to have recovered, which is very good. So, anyway, welcome today. So, Johanna gave you the big picture stuff, what's happening with international science, and we've got these multi-levels of government doing different things, but most adaptation is going to have to happen at the local level. Now, we've been doing research on this for a couple of decades now, and out of that research has come a number of things that I think you'll find interesting. And the first one is, if we want to improve adaptation, and particularly adaptation policies and plans, we need to improve collaboration across government, business and the community sectors. Government can't do this alone, all right? We're looking for some big changes here, and we've got to get everyone working together. So we've got to focus on the fact, and one of the ways you can actually get everyone pushing in the same direction is to focus on building resilience. Get everyone to agree, okay, look, our overall goal is to have a sustainable and resilient community, and we want our businesses to be like that, and we want government to be like that. And that means one of the ideas of actually improving that is to have maybe a collaborative public sector funding component. So at the moment in the public sector, whether it's the local council, the state or federal governments, money's allocated in the budget each year to each different department or agency. What about if some money was put aside as a pot and the government will say, okay, we want to fund solutions to these problems, you guys get together and figure out how you can work together to address that. So you get different agencies working together, different levels of government working together, and maybe different businesses or community organisations. So that means each agency has an incentive, they'll get more funding if they collaborate with others to actually address the problem. The idea of local community resilience grants. At the moment, local councils and state governments put out grants for local communities to do things. I've sat on review panels for applications for various community grants and things. Why not have a little pot of money put aside to say, if you've got an idea for how you can improve resilience in your local community, let us know and we'll pick the best ones and give you the money to go and do that. Climate research is embedded within emergency services. At the moment, the emergency services are running over here and they're running out, literally putting out bushfires and helping people in floods. And you've got your climate researchers over here saying, oh, the climate's changing. If we get them to talk to each other, it means that the people in the emergency services got a clearer idea of what's coming down the track, of what increased risks they're going to have to be dealing with over time, and can think about how to deploy their resources in the best way to make that work. And for the climate researchers, it's really good because they're seeing on the ground what information people need to have. They can go back and do that research and find that out for them. And improving networks across agencies. This is something that we found when I was doing some work up in central Queensland. Having networks of collaboration champions within different departments, people who really like to collaborate with other people, having some sort of panels where someone at the senior level, a group on panels that are encouraging that kind of collaboration and rewarding it. So getting these agencies to work together in different ways. The second thing is to improve business and community engagement. And again, this gets back to the point that governments can't do everything. We all need to be making changes. So 3 things came out of our research there. The first one was to inform the community. Let them know what's going on. Let them know what their risks are. And make that information easy to find and easy to understand. So one of the things that's great down here on the Gold Coast that I discovered a couple of years ago was that emergency website you've got where you can go and look at what roads are closed, what areas are flooded, where the power outages are, what the storm warnings are, all in one place. That kind of thing's great. We can bring together more information like that that's easy to understand, easy to see, but also let people know it's there. Make that dashboard, that emergency dashboard, known to more people. We need to engage with the community in terms of promoting what we need to do, get some sort of mutual exchange of information. So it's not just experts telling you what you've got to do, it's local people saying, we've noticed that this has changed. We've noticed that the creek levels are coming up a lot higher than they used to, or that we're getting more bushfires now than we used to, or that our local waterways, there's less water in them and something's going on here, and getting people to work together and engage with that. And then being prepared to provide that support. Now that does mean money, but the money you invest in adapting and building your resilience now is money you're going to save down the track from having to rebuild or the higher insurance premiums you're going to have to pay. You do need expertise on this. You need local expertise, people with hands-on real-world knowledge, and people with the knowledge about climate change and what's happening. And you need to have some sort of guidance so that people know where they can turn. How do I make my house more resilient? What are the dangers that we face? The state government, for example, does have a Resilient Homes website where you can go in and do a little checklist of, what are the kind of major events that you've had in the past, what kind of simple things can you do around your home to defend against those. And the third thing is to reduce the theory-practice gap. So there's kind of a difference between what the researchers are doing that are interested in and what the practitioners are doing, so the planners and the policymakers on the ground, and what they need to do. So breaking that down, and this gap is bilateral, it works both ways. We need to understand as researchers what you as practitioners need, and you as practitioners need to know what information's out there. We need to reduce those translation errors so that when, for example, the public is told that they're living on a 1 in 100-year floodplain, it doesn't mean if you just had a flood, there won't be another one for 100 years. It means that in any one year, there's a 1% average chance of you getting flooded. And you could have 3 floods in 100 years and then none for 200 years. You need to recognise that the gap in this theory knowledge is cyclical and iterative. So by having a learning process where you learn where the errors are, you can actually improve and reduce that gap. And we need to integrate different types of knowledge. So we need to know a little bit of what's happening in terms of meteorology. We need to know what's happening in hydrology with the water. We need to know what's happening with bushfires. We need to know health and the impacts of that going on. And sitting in the audience today is someone who's an expert on this. Estefania, who is working with the council now and is just completing her PhD with Johanna and I, did her PhD on closing this knowledge theory gap. So she's a really good person to talk to about this, and she knows more than I do. So you're very privileged in the Gold Coast City Council to have someone like that on your team. So I was asked to say a few things about the Gold Coast Resilience and Sustainability Strategy. And at the moment, it's the one-page summary up there. There's more going on, but it gives you some ideas of what's going on. And there are 3 particular outcomes that it's focused on. Obviously, it's the built environment is resilient to the impacts of climate change, that ecosystems are resilient, and community is climate-ready and resilient. So we've got to think about the natural environment, the built environment, and people. And the planning and policy making is always about people, and we're trying to make their lives better and make them more resilient. In terms of measuring success, and this is really important, with mitigation we can measure success really easily because we can estimate how much greenhouse gases are going into the atmosphere each year. We can see whether it's going down or whether it's going up. Resilience is a lot harder to measure. Adaptation is a lot harder to measure. But one of the things you can do, and one of the things that you're focusing on in the council, is those nature-based solutions. And so using things like mangroves to reduce runoff from land, so that reduces erosion and also slows down the amount of water that's leaving an area, so it's got a chance to reduce the amount of backup of water behind a barrier. Permanent protection of land in strategic areas. So there are some areas where you've got some very valuable assets and you want to defend those. So how are you going to do that? You've got flood levy, you're going to have some sort of fire break or fire management system there. And then you've got to have community climate literacy. You've got to let people know that there is a problem. Now, we've been through a pretty interesting period over the last few years with major bushfires. We've got bushfires burning in the hinterland here in rainforest. This has never happened before. Rainforests normally don't burn. Binnaburra burnt down. You know, this is inconceivable a few years ago. The climate is changing, and that's causing that drying out and leading to those fires. We've seen repeated flooding events, not just here in northern New South Wales. People, you know, they have a flood a few months later, they've just cleaned up, it floods again, they clean up, floods again. The trauma that causes is enormous. So we've got to do something about this. So here is a very complicated diagram. It's from an article that I wrote with Elnaz Tarabi, who used to work for the council, and Aishan Dedikorkut-House, who's my partner and co-researcher. And we did a comparison of the Gold Coast and the Sunshine Coast. And we looked at adaptation, the different dimensions of adaptation, what you have to deal with. And basically what we found is the literature told us there were these 4 different dimensions, and we found a 5th, which was the political dimension. And the political dimension is really important because not everybody accepts that the climate is changing. Not everyone accepts that even if the climate is changing, they need to do something about it. And if someone knocks on your door and says, "I'm sorry, we have to move you out of your house because it's just getting too risky for you to live here," there's going to be resistance. So this is going to be very political, and there are going to be some very hard discussions and conversations you're going to have over this. So the 5 different basically dimensions of adaptation is obviously the political dimension, the urban institutional resilience dimension, the urban economic resilience. And think about the Gold Coast. I mean, a big part of our economy relies on tourism. Tourists come because they like to go and sit on the beach. If the beaches are eroding, because we're getting more storms coming in or the sea level's rising, how are we going to attract those people? It's even worse in other areas. I mean, people up north who rely on the Great Barrier Reef for tourism, what's going to happen to them in 50 years' time if a lot of the reef is bleached? How are they going to cope? We've got infrastructure we've got to think about, and so there's obviously engineering solutions there. There's the ecological resilience, so we've got to think about the very unique flora and fauna we've got here, the different ecosystems, how are we going to allow those to adapt? Building wildlife corridors, for example, to allow migration of species as their climate changes might be a good way to do that. And finally, social and community resilience. Now, this can be something really simple. It can be something like, okay, in the case of there's a disaster coming, we need people to evacuate. Can you get some of the community groups to go around and check some of the people in their local area and see if they're older or if they've got mobility problems? Is there someone that's going to go and visit them and help them get out of the way of the hazard and get to an evacuation site? That kind of community resilience building is really important. In those big bushfires we had back in the 2020 summer, one of the things that worked really well was there were all these volunteer firefighters that went out to fight the fires, but behind them were all these community organisations that were providing them with tents and sleeping bags, cooking food for them, setting up showers so they could have a wash and have a lie down. And all that community resilience, all that assistance wasn't really costed. We don't have a dollar value for that, but it was really important for building that community's resilience. So we've got to think about all those 5 dimensions as you're developing your strategies and as you're developing your plans. Now the thing is, you're not alone. We're not alone. The UN Sustainable Development Goals were signed in 2015. 193 countries signed up, including Australia. This follows on from the 1992 commitment to Agenda 21 that all the world wants to achieve sustainable development. And of those 17 goals, there's one that's specifically on climate change, and that talks about building resilience and adaptive capacity to climate-related hazards, integrating climate adaptation into existing policies, so integrating it into your city plan, for example, and providing education, awareness and institutional capacity. So making people know what the problems are, what the solutions are, and building the capacity to help people make that transition. Then there's the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. It doesn't just talk about mitigation. That's been the big focus of the media, but even in the original 1992 version, Articles 3 and 4 talked about adaptation. There's a really useful tool that is set up called the Adaptation Knowledge Portal. It's got lots of case studies that you can go to and have a look at, seeing what's being done around the world, saying, hey, that could be something that we could use here. And finally, the 2015 Paris Agreement, it wasn't just about mitigation, there was also commitments to building climate change adaptation as well. So in summary, the Gold Coast is highly vulnerable to the risks of climate change. We're low-lying, we've got a lot of water frontage here, we've got the risk of bushfires in the hinterland, we've got the risk of flooding, we've got land slippage problems, we've got coastal erosion problems. So we are going to face some very serious issues. These pose risks to people, building and infrastructure, and not just council assets, but also people's homes, people's businesses, and a lot of the natural assets that we rely on, particularly for our tourism sector. There are 3 levels of response, the national, state and local, but the local one is where the rubber hits the road. This is where we've got to make those changes. There's a need to improve intersectoral collaboration across the community, government and business sectors, and we've got to narrow the theory-practice gap. And one of the keys to good planning or good policy making and making it work is good community engagement, getting people on side, getting them willing to do things. Plans and strategies need to address all dimensions of adaptation and resilience. In that paper that I cited earlier, which is great by the way, you should all get a copy, makes a great Christmas present, particularly for people you don't like. Okay. So in that strategy, we talk about 3 different kinds of adaptation. One of them is static adaptation, where you simply, a bridge washes away, you build it back. You're in the same situation you were, and you just keep building it back every time there's a flood. One of them is the next one up is the socio-ecological one, which is where you start to do things like maybe you build a flood levee, or maybe you do some plantings to stop erosion, things like that. But then we need to go into the 3rd level, which is transformational. We need to get to that transformational change. We need to imagine a Gold Coast, and let's face it, the Gold Coast is a brilliant place to live, and we all want to see it keep going, and we all want to see future generations be able to enjoy the kind of lifestyle that we enjoy here. So how do we do that? What does a sustainable Gold Coast actually look like? What would a resilient Gold Coast look like? What kind of industries would we have? What kind of housing would we have? What would the local council be doing for us? So we need to think about that transformative change and how we get to it. This is part of a much broader international agenda of transformation, so we're not alone. Every country in the world is facing this, but we're fortunate in that we have the knowledge, we can afford to make this change, we have all the technology we need, we just need to have the political will to do it, and we need to get business and the community to support and be willing to make those changes themselves. And finally, we're not just talking about risks here. This is an opportunity to reshape and make the Gold Coast even better. So I'm going to finish there. There's just a few things I've got up here. We have a thing called the Climate Action Beacon at Griffith University that Johanna and I are part of. It brings together researchers and educators from across the whole university. We have all sorts of things going on that you might be interested in. We're launching a Becoming Climate Ready short course. Enrolments will start in mid-March and the course will start in mid-April. It will go for a few weeks. It's online, it's flexible. It's specifically designed for people working in local government in Australia to give you the basic skills and knowledge you need to be able to help your local area adapt. So this is the first of what we hope will be many professional training courses. If you go to that link there, it'll give you information about it. And as I said, the enrolments will open in a few weeks. And finally, I created and run a set of climate adaptation programs. There's the graduate certificate and the Masters of Climate Change Adaptation. They're designed for people who are working, who have no background in climate change, to come in and pick up the knowledge they need. It's all online. You can do it part-time when you're working. You can do projects related to your job as part of it as well. And I was speaking to a couple of people before the session who had actually done it and actually quite liked it. So there's out on the table there where you sign up, there's a few little postcards. If you want to grab those, it's got a QR code where you can go and find out a bit more about it. And finally, the City of Gold Coast has asked if you could just take the survey about the session and give them some feedback. So if you scan the QR code, it'll take you to a website and you can fill in the survey there. So that's it for now. We're open for taking questions. So Johanna, if you want to join me up here. Obviously, if you've got any difficult questions, you send them to Johanna. If you've got easy questions, send them to me. Please keep your questions short or comments short because then we get lots of people have a chance to ask something. Unfortunately, we don't have a roving mic. So if you put your hand up, I'll point at you. You can tell me the question. I'll summarise it so that it'll be recorded and then we'll try and answer it. So if anyone has a question, please feel free to put your hand up now. Oh, good. Yes. Yeah, sure. So the question was, what about the other councils around the Gold Coast? Have they got strategies as well? In Queensland, the QCoast 2100 program allowed all the coastal councils to develop a strategy. Most of them took that up, so we've got them all the way through Brisbane, Sunshine Coast, all the way up the coast there. The Tweed Shire Council also is working on strategies as well, and around the country, different states have different similar programs as well to try to help those coastal councils develop it. So it's different in different council areas and it's different state to state. So for example, in Queensland, we're adapting to a 0.8 metre sea level rise by 2100. In New South Wales, they're adapting to a 1.1 metre sea level rise. So depending on which side of the Tweed you're on, depends on how high your seas are going to be apparently. So, yeah. Yes. Any figures on the sea level rise on the Gold Coast today? Okay, so look, the average sea level rise for the world has been about 20 centimetres, but it varies from country to country and place to place. If you're closer to the equator, because the Earth is spinning, you get this centrifugal force, so the sea level rises are bigger than 20 centimetres. I can't from memory remember exactly what the sea level rise measurements have been here down on the Gold Coast, but you should be able to get them if you go to the Bureau of Meteorology website and look at the tidal information. you should be able to get records there of what's happening with tides.
Yes. The Australian Institute of Architects have adopted a climate change policy where they are pushing local government to improve the way that we build houses and commercial buildings. What sort of engagement does City of Gold Coast have with the Institute or the Queensland chapter?
That's a good question. I don't know because I don't work for the City of Gold Coast. Is someone from the City of Gold Coast would like to answer that question? How much is the City of Gold Coast engaging with Architects Australia and their policy on? Does anyone have any? Estefania, who knows a lot about the theory practice game.
Thank you, Michael. At this stage, we haven't engaged yet, so the strategy has been endorsed. So we are in the process of designing our implementation plan. So I had a question from Gecko as well. If we have already started that engagement process, so not yet. We are mapping the information that is available, trying to build and understand where the community is at, the sectors at with their adaptation approaches. So probably will be contacting you in the future.
Stay happy.
Not yet. We haven't really get into the design and the specifics of it. We are trying first high level to define our direction, and then from there we will start going down to every specific action that we have. Yeah.
There is some useful background information on. You can stay here if you want. Someone else is probably going to have a question for you, but you can take a break. There are some national surveys on attitudes towards climate change and awareness of it, and whether the change is being driven by human activities or natural processes. Those surveys are out there in the public domain. So if you search for surveys of attitudes towards climate change, you'll get some idea of the broader area, but I don't know anything specific for the Gold Coast. Do you know anything for the Gold Coast?
I was just going to add that that's a really key point for any Australians, is that climate literacy of the community. Over the years, so I think I started researching adaptation in 2007, and over the years when I moved to the Gold Coast 2009, I've always said, imagine if Gold Coast had heat waves. Imagine what, would the health services be there? We have to start thinking about that, and do the community members understand what to do during a heat wave? And so going through a heat wave during the summer, several of those, I think it is the community climate literacy is really important.
Any other questions? All right, well, thank you very much for having us. We're very pleased we've got such a good turnout today, and thank you for the questions. As I said, there's some more information about what we're doing at Griffith if you want to pick up one of the little cards from the table there. Did you want to make any closing comments? Yep.